Load off from your busy workday and listen to the dulcet tunes of our guests, who are all over the cybersecurity landscape. We're going to ask them some hard questions, not going to lie, probably some softballs too. But no matter what, it's going to be a good time. So sit back, pour yourself a nice hot cup of coffee, or something stronger if it's that time of day, and enjoy Coffee Talk with Serge.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for another episode of Coffee Talk with Serge, a special 1-1 edition where we interview folks from around the industry we've known and respected for years and years and have coffee. But instead of coffee today, I've got my water bottle because it's summertime coming up, and hydrate's important. With me today is Scott Roberts, who I want to say you don't need an introduction, but I kind of have to introduce you. But I don't know how much time we have. Like a half hour. So Scott Roberts, threat intelligence, cybersecurity, bon vivant. Is that fair?
Ooh, that might be my new business card.
You can have that one. I met you, you've been, well, I'll let you do it. Scott Roberts, tell me a little bit who you are and your bit of a background.
Well, I have been doing this cybersecurity thing for, I've crossed the line where I think I have to just start saying 20 years at this point. It feels, the decade really gets you. But I've been doing this my entire career. I started doing cybersecurity actually as a internship in college and have just kept going ever since then. Been a couple different places, was at GitHub for a while, had been at Apple for a little bit. Now I'm at a security startup called Interpres. Just continue to try to apply a lot of these threat intelligence lessons.
So at GitHub, you were like the first security person, right?
I was the first like primarily defensively focused person. So
okay.
We had like a lot of startups, there was really no security culture initially. They then brought somebody in. His job was just to be all of security, which I think we all know is not really a tenable thing for anyone. So two of us.
I mean,
were
it's
hired
fun until it's not, right?
It works until that first incident, and so he brought in two of us. Me focused on defense. A guy by the name of Ben Taves focused primarily on the red team stuff, and then from there stuff just exploded, and we both built teams, and kept going on from there.
So I'm looking at your background, a bit of all the way back to Symantec and Mandiant days. Like you, at some point during this 20 plus year career, I'm right there with you. There's a pivot, and I made it as well. And I'm trying to find like that moment when it happened, like straight cybersecurity, SOC, incident response, and then you focused on nation state. You focused on those APT groups. Was that a byproduct of just interest, or it was just, this is available and it's cool?
I think it was a combination of things. I mean, one, I think the industry moved. When I think about when I first got started, and it's always going to be focused a little bit based on where you are. I mean, I was at before even Mandiant, I was at Symantec. Well, even though we weren't on the AV portion of the whole thing, we were focused on a lot of those basic commodity malware. And if you go back to 2006, that's what we were looking at. We were looking at, SQL Slammer, and we were looking at a lot of these very like low level criminal kind of things that were going on. When I moved to Mandiant, and when I was at Mandiant, I worked primarily consulting to a federal client, and that changed a lot of the perspective of what we were focused on. And I suddenly started hearing about what's going on with the nation state sort of things, which is partially about who you're around. I mean, Mandiant was largely started by a lot of guys who came out of Air Force OSI and Rob Lee and Kevin Mandia, these folks who were doing these, Titan Rain and Moonlight Maze and all of those initial nation state level things. So I just started hearing about it and all that. And then, when I moved to Mantech, that was just a lot of the focus we were at. We were a defense industrial based company. You're obviously going to be the target of
focus
all
on
the criminal
those,
stuff too.
Right.
But also suddenly you're really in the thick of it. So I would say between Mandiant and Mantech is really where I made that shift into primarily focusing on that kind of work.
And now the role that you're in is kind of the combination of those things. So I guess ever since GitHub a bit was, hey, I'm doing the operational work, but I'm also helping build this program out, which I think is super. I mean, one, it's an amazing task and an amazing achievement. What were like the hiccups and the great moments that you remember from doing that?
Oh man, I mean, at GitHub we got to see so many cool things. I was at GitHub when it really went from a very small thing that a certain group of developers were really into to being kind of the center of the developer ecosystem. And interestingly enough, that came along with a lot of even the bad guys suddenly realizing what was going on. I mean, one of the ones that I won't forget was the Hammer Toss report that came out from Mandiant, where they were suddenly talking about, okay, now GitHub, this company I'm working for, we see a vendor report saying, hey, you're part of an adversary's infrastructure. They're relying on you as part of this attack, both for obfuscation, but also just because, hey, we were going to be available.
It's a repo, right? I remember because you were at GitHub and I was working at the White House, and I think that's when our paths crossed. Right. And it was a lot of hey, GitHub's awesome until it's not, and balancing that is really tough because as a company, even when you look at time after at Apple, it's hard to balance usability versus security. And I think you're doing that both internally in a leadership role, building out a security program, but at the same time externally to your customer base. Those are 1-1? Like rules are rules, right?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by that?
So the same rules that you're applying, externally to the user base at GitHub, are those the same rules you're going to apply internally to the users internally, to the staff? The policy you're rolling out to a GitHub wide.
Yeah.
Would you roll that?
You want to keep stuff consistently. And I mean, let's be honest, once you get to a big enough company, where you can't know everybody and know what it is. I mean, you get to a large enough company, insider threat starts to become a concern. And, as well as just the idea of, I can trust a person, but do I trust their laptop? Do I trust every action that's being taken on their behalf? I mean, I think in the current security space, that has to be a part of it.
I think I completely agree. When you look at, identity management becoming an issue and just that zero trust model, we all knock it and we all remember it. We're old enough and it was called like 3 different things, but that same concept is there. It's just, every transaction is managed and authenticated. And applying those from operational days into leadership days, I guess that's what led you to write a book.
The funny thing is, the thing that led me to write the book was somebody asked, and I thought it sounded like a fun challenge. But I think that's hopefully where the benefit of writing the book really came out was, this idea of, I think cyber threat intelligence is in a really interesting place, largely to help lead in a lot of cases. I mean, so much of leadership is understanding context, and so much of threat intelligence is about, how do we get and find that context? And so I think it's kind of natural that those two things kind of go together.
So for the folks watching, when I say written a book, I don't mean Scott's chapter in Bluenomicon, which is available at, I believe, Conf. We've got an event coming up. I mean his first book, Intelligence-Driven Incident Response, which came out in,
2017.
Was it 17?
It's a while ago.
So it's you and Rebecca Brown. And the only thing I think that was missing was there was no chain, diamond, pyramid. Like, it was just context. And it's exactly when I think intelligence is exactly that. That's the context I'm looking for. If I would have known it was that easy to get you to write, to just ask you to write something, I'd ask for more than an essay. I'd ask for the entire book. That'd have been great.
I mean, next time we'll do that. No, I mean, what got me to do that? I had never really considered the idea of writing a book. I mean, it was very much a kind of luck of the draw happenstance thing. I was working at GitHub at the time. I ended up getting to do booth duty at PyCon, and
Wow.
there weren't a lot of Python people at GitHub at the time. We were largely a Ruby shop, and so they said, okay, who knows enough Python to go to a Python conference and be able to have an intelligent conversation? And it turns out it was mostly people in the security team. And someone from O'Reilly's walking around and just saying, "Hey, we're we're always looking for books. If you want to talk about that." And I ended up going back over to their booth randomly and said, "Hey, I know you were looking for Python stuff. I am not that good at Python, but do you want security content?" And they said, "Yes, we will totally take security content." And it was just that kind of happenstance thing that they said, "What do you want to talk about? What do you think the industry needs to hear about?" And at that time, I was not in a threat intelligence role at GitHub. I was doing security, but the folks we had, myself and John Swanson and Jay Swan, we all kind of had an intelligence-y mindset to doing day-to-day security operations. And I thought, that's a really cool thing. Can we talk about that? Can we talk about how you kind of, get that chocolate in the peanut butter kind of thing?
Well, I think by default, if you're the security guy and no one's doing threat intelligence, you're actually doing threat. That's how I think that the mind. That's how that works. It's exactly how that works.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I do think threat intelligence is a useful thing, even if you're not a threat intelligence analyst, even if you're a reverse engineer, even if you're a detection analyst, even if you're an incident responder. Having that mindset, it's one of those skill sets that really shapes how you look at everything else and how you kind of evaluate what's coming in. And kind of the closest thing I can actually liken it to is folks who become doctors or lawyers. I had a bunch of friends who were going through law school, and their big thing was law is about realizing a way of thinking about things and having a structure to it. And I was like, oh, that's exactly what intelligence analysis is. It's a structure of how you work through a problem. And I think you can apply that to almost anything. So
book comes out. I mean, I loved it. If you're working in a threat intelligence field, like, it's definitely one of those like core books that's on your shelf, right? You and Rebecca just, okay, this is what I need to do. It's not so much the technical zeros and ones end of it, but it's the structured methodologies, I think, that I liked most, because growing up in that intelligence world, and then switching out into a public sector role, hey, how do we define this? And I think that really helped a lot of people. So codifying that, what was a huge deal. I really, really appreciate you and Rebecca for doing that. That was one of the reasons why Bluenomicon came into being, the idea of codifying knowledge, turning it from tacit to explicit knowledge. So when I asked you sure, Mick, I'd love to write a chapter in Bluenomicon. That's great. Why is contributing to a project like Bluenomicon important?
I mean, ultimately speaking, I actually think security is getting a lot better, but I think we all know it's not. Cybersecurity is not where any of us want it to be. We still have systemic problems. We still have these massive failures. We've still been focusing on a lot of things, and honestly, technology can get better, tools get better, those help a lot, but ultimately it comes down to the people who are doing it, the people who are putting in the work, the people who are using the tools and analyzing the data. And so, from my perspective, anything I can do to help make the people who are involved in cybersecurity better, whether from the entire range of roles and all that, to me, it's a rising tide raises all boats kind of thing. I want the security people at my bank, at my hospital, at my coffee shop to be better at what they do, because ultimately, those people doing a better job of this is going to make me safer, which is going to make everybody else safer. So, from my perspective, if I can contribute to that in any way, and somebody reads Bluenomicon, and I mean, I don't know about my essay, I know I got a lot of value out of a bunch of them, and if that makes anybody a little bit better, frankly, it makes all of us a little bit better.
Well, I appreciate you writing for our book. Your chapter specifically was, hey, look, as a CISO, it's not all sunshines. Um, those leadership roles where you're enforcing those security policies, hey, you're not always the most popular guy. Um, One of the best things that and you and I have known each other for a really long time. One of the things I've always admired is your quality, the analogies that you spin, the metaphors and similes to make things super explainable, right? I have homaged, cyber vegetables over and over again. But you've been a leader and you've been an operator and you've been a user, okay? You are a leader that's enforcing a security policy that's not popular. How are you communicating that, to your operators versus your users? Because I think tone sets that big thing. Is the 2008 version of Scott the same message as the 2023 version?
Oh no, very, very much different. I mean, look, I was like, I think a lot of us, I was the one, when I was young and just came into this field, it was, we should do this because it's the right thing to do, and we need to be as secure as possible, and we need to fix all the problems so we don't have problems. And really, that mindset doesn't work. And I can think of one of the best example of this I have was when we first started rolling out endpoint security at GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
Previous to that, basically, GitHub bought you a laptop that was your work laptop, but it was just a laptop and it wasn't special and it had nothing on it. And we suddenly started saying,
which,
hey,
to be fair, is not unique to GitHub, right?
Oh,
Most
no.
times it's, hey, do you have a laptop? Keep using that. You're fine, right?
And early had been exactly that. But we started saying, hey, we're going to start rolling out some things on your laptop. And we had a really radical culture of freedom and openness, and you can do what you need, and everyone was root, and all those things. And people pushed back really hard initially. And I got a lot of good advice from our CISO at the time, Sean Davenport. And he's like,
Mm-hmm.
look, you're a service. You are not in we can come down and we can enforce this, but everyone's going to fight you and everyone's going to push back. Or you can look at this as what it's supposed to be, which is you're there to serve them. And so what we actually did is we posted a lot of details about here's what we're going to do, here's what it's going to look like, and I got all the pushback you'd expect. It's going to be Big Brother, you're going to spy on us, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And so we decided to go directly to all those people who were saying that. We posted a version of here's all the stuff we're going to be looking for and here's what we're going to be doing. What parts of it do you have a problem with? And simply by asking that question, by going to those users, by going to the most problematic, the most, we hate this, we don't like it, whatever users, and saying, well, let us explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, and we'll tell you. And there were some places where they pushed back on us and they said, well, I don't like that you're looking at this thing. And I actually worked with our legal counsel, Hannah Potet, to do some really, really cool back and forth of, we can see what we need to see, but we can't see stuff that we
all
know.
the things.
And, yeah,
right.
we came up with technical solutions, and that was great. But the biggest thing we came to was by explaining to them what we were trying to do and why, and giving them a view into it. Most of the things they looked at, they went, oh, that's really reasonable. Like we understand why you could use that and how you're going to do that. And the funny thing about that was those same people who were the biggest, just this is garbage, this is draconian, they became our champions. When somebody would make a random aside of like, I don't understand why they need to spy on us, they'd go, no, I can explain to you how they're not spying on us, and I can explain to you why they're doing it. And so I really think by taking that open and transparent and service kind of oriented mindset, unless you're at a security vendor, we don't make money. That's not the job of security. Our job is to help other people make money. And so we're here to serve the business, not to tell it how to do what we think it should do. And so I think being humble and kind of remembering that and showing what you're doing is trying to enable, when people understand you have that approach, that level of openness makes threat intelligence, incident response, intrusion detection, all of those things, one, easier, two, more effective, and three, far less adversarial. And, because the guy I never want to feel like is the internal affairs in the cop procedural where, they see the one guy come in and everybody's just mad because he's just there to bust everybody. I've worked in places where we ran security like that, and it doesn't work.
But I mean, as have I. Would you say that security as a whole has shifted from that approach? Like a very draconian cybersecurity approach is essentially what you and I pretty much grew up on, where it was, hey, we're security, I have authority. Would you say either that authority has been kind of peeled back a little bit, or the I don't want to say empathy, but empathy is the word I keep coming back to, has shifted a bit where, oh, you're just trying to do your job?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think one, when you and I came up and you went to somebody and said, hey, your computer's been compromised, people would look at you like, what's that mean? And is that a thing? And can somebody even do that? And I think now, between media and news and all that, like, people are aware this is a problem.
Right.
Look, I think some organizations, to your point, have kind of had their authority stripped away from them so far that it's not, that, to your point, it doesn't happen that way simply because users say, no, I'm not going to. I think there are still organizations that are running in just as draconian and heavy-handed a way as possible. I optimistically want to believe we are seeing a lot more of a middle ground. We are seeing a lot more of people who've seen both sides of that and are taking that kind of middle approach of, look, I've even in my hopefully enlightened state, I've had moments where I've had to be like, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to need to take this laptop from you right now. Like, we need to investigate what's going on.
Right.
It's a last ditch. Like, I hate to get to that point. You want to avoid it as much as possible.
And I think security as a whole, as an industry, I think has pivoted a bit to understanding more of the business value of security, or the business use cases of security. I remember I moderated a panel last summer with Sharon and Ryan and Sean Thompson, a few folks from your bunch. It was a great panel. And one of the things that was mentioned was, hey, the business value. And I'm thinking of that, I'm looking at early career business. No, I'm not here for the business. I'm here for security. And now that, baby Mick, baby Scott's is all grown up, I understand that now. What clever analogy have you found, or metaphor have you found, to spin business value to a wizard?
Oh, early career Scott Roberts, and I assume Mick as well, would have slapped a $500 lock on a $5 item just to keep it perfectly protected. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to. I think it's recognizing that our job is to enable. Our job is not to be perfect. And look, I've worked in situations where, we knew we were taking risks, but it's not worth $10,000 of protection to protect a $500 item. And sometimes the risk is not as bad as the cure. I think the other thing, and I think this just comes with experience, we also understand at this point that most things sit in the middle of the bell curve. Like, the number of times, I can think of a dozen times where I saw an incident and I went, if the bad guys knew what they really had, what they could really do with the access they'd gotten, it would have been devastating. And they deployed a coin miner instead. Great. Good,
well, I
good
think
job.
we saw that, was at Twitter like a month ago, 3 years ago, somewhere in that range, where all those accounts were taken over and tweeting like, hey, donate to this Bitcoin wallet.
Yep.
When you look at some of the accesses, and I have, I've seen the same thing where you have admin or root on this specific host that you really should not be on. And this is what you did. You put a coin miner. So I agree. The business end of it, I guess it's getting more common. Um, but I don't think that changes the fundamentals of what we've been saying for, and there's still your phrase again, the cyber vegetables. We're still talking about identity management, making links safe. Um, like what I've got fruits, vegetables. What else is there?
Yeah, I mean, I remember doing an onboarding presentation, and it was pretty simple: strong passwords, two-factor authentication, apply your patches. Everything else, call the security team. And honestly, that's still good advice. And to your point, how many people are still trying to do basic inventory management?
Well, that's that Sisyphean task is, hey, number one and number two on the controls are ID your assets and patch your assets.
Yeah.
And yeah, how hard is that? And now that, again, going back to the business sense, well, we just acquired company X. We acquired all of their assets. What's that patch level? And sure, we want to scope that, we want to get that in line, or hey, we want to roll out this new product or platform or security control. And the time it would take us to do things and the time that would cost, the man hours spent, it's just, I feel old that I'm considering that now. I don't know if that's wisdom or just old.
I'm gonna go with wisdom on that one.
Thank you, because you're having the same thoughts, right?
I do have largely the same thoughts, and I work with a bunch of students at Utah State University, and whenever any of them ask me, "Hey, do I want to do X? Do I want to do Y for my career?" Specifically around cybersecurity, I point them at the same thing. I say, read Cliff Stoll's Cuckoo's Egg and tell me which part you find most interesting. And one of the things that I always like about that is then they'll always come back to me and go, "Okay, but how much of that are we still doing?" And my response is, "Oh, most organizations wish they were doing as much as Cliff Stoll was doing in that time frame."
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that we're still advancing, I look at the work that I do, and understanding the adversaries, figuring out how they're operating and how we can most get in front of that. I mean, that's my day job, and that's still what something Cliff Stoll was doing in the early '80s, and I still look at that as kind of a pinnacle kind of thing to be working on. And so I think in a lot of ways, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, we're still doing a lot of the same things we've been doing.
I think the boulder has gotten slightly farther up the hill. I think it's no longer two-factor. Yeah, it's multi-factor. So we are old enough to remember, hey, look, I'm going to send you an email, period. And that's your second factor. Or a text message. That's it.
And the hard part about that, I think, also I think we have to keep in mind is the goalposts have been moving the whole time. Have we moved the boulder an absolute distance a lot farther? Absolutely. It's gotten monumentally better than it has been. And when I run into people who take a cynical approach to where cybersecurity is, I'm going, no, we as an industry have moved mountains. Mm-hmm. The thing that people don't take into account, and I do run into this especially when I talk to IT people, is we have an intelligent adversary on the other side.
So what do you think the biggest change has been the evolution in cybersecurity and threat intelligence?
Ooh, I mean, some days it feels like the more it changes, the more it stays the same. I think just the proliferation more than anything else. I mean, you go back to the 90s and 2000s, and it was really a very limited kind of thing. There were certain players, but not a lot of players. And now, I'm sure, I don't know if Mandiant's releasing all their new threat campaigns or all that, but something tells me they have more criminal groups now than they had groups overall 10 years ago.
Right. I think you and I are from an era where there was like a handful of APT groups, right? A split across countries.
Yeah.
I think we talk a bit about that Sisyphean task of pushing the boulder. Security, we're doing it every day. The same things that we talked about 20 years ago, passwords, strong passwords, two-factor, now it's multi-factor. I think we've gotten better, right? But has the mountain gotten taller?
I absolutely think it has. I mean, I think that the amount that certain threat actors can bring to bear is a totally different thing. I mean, if you go back, one of my favorite books for just taking the other perspective on a lot of these challenges was Dark Territory. And Dark Territory, I do not remember who it was by, but was a walkthrough of essentially how American offensive cyber really developed. And what's really funny about it is the first 20 years of it is a little bit of a sideshow. It's a little bit of, hey, we've got these nerds in the corner, and I don't know, they say they can do something, so it's not going to hurt if they play some games with telephone lines while the actual troops are doing things. But they talk about in that book these kind of left alone groups that were doing things like running telephone DDoSes against military units in Haiti so that when the US invaded, they couldn't mount an effective response. They were doing things like messing with anti-aircraft missiles in Bosnia, Serbia, so that the stealth bombers were a little more stealthy than they were. And it's just funny because they weren't really thought of as an important or core thing, and now it's a central part.
That's a standard, right?
Everything. And so I think that when you look at just a world where it used to be to use an analogy, some sprinkles on the top of the sundae that is this combined arms conflict. And now you look at what's going on in Ukraine, where cyber and
it is the fifth domain, which becomes the big domain, right?
Exactly. There's another book I actually read for some schoolwork I'm doing called 2034 that's talking about a hypothetical global kerfuffle that starts with a cyber. It has multiple cyber elements to it, and I think it's telling that the admiral who wrote this book about his idea of what a future conflict is going to look like, cyber is the start, not just an added thing that we let some guys in the corner do because they kept asking. So
I think by default,
changed.
cyber is going to be a part of it. We talked about our backgrounds being what they are. We have a heavy DIB influence and a lot of exposure to that area. But what would you say is the biggest unaddressed victim group? Or I guess a better way to phrase it, us as cyber professionals, right? We're defending the corporate networks. It's what we do. We're trying to get the greater internet. Who do you think isn't really being taken care of when it comes to internet from a security perspective? Like, we see a lot of scams out there, and they're always going to be there. But what group do you think we, as professionals, we need to kind of take a lens at and say, hey, we should look at this as a problem? That's not AI. You can't say AI.
Oh, I mean, AI is a part of it. No, I do think AI is going to be a part of it. I think what I look at as one of the biggest challenges right now is the role of information operations, as it's becoming something that just can be done by almost anyone. And we talked a little bit about that commoditizing of, first I think we saw the commoditizing of APT, and you see criminal actors now doing things that only APT groups did 10 years ago. I do think we're seeing the commoditization right now of information operations in the same way. And it's going to go from something that, a handful of massive countries are capable of doing to a much bigger problem. And on one hand, I sit there and go, is that really a cyber threat, a cybersecurity problem? But I don't know who else in most organizations could address it.
I got to be honest, I'm having that same debate in my head internally. Like, misinformation, disinformation is a huge issue, and I just don't know if it's a technical solution. But then I look at things like, I don't know if you saw the recent work, I believe it was Graphica that put out, where you can use generative AI to spin up misinformation 10 minutes. I remember back when I was the CISO for the Buttigieg campaign, this was in 2019. Hey, Mick, do you think deepfakes are a problem? I'm like, no, because in 2019, it was not there. So to your point, I think that's going to be an issue. Okay, you wrote one book, you're going to write another book on this. What would your biggest solution be for the misinformation, disinformation problem? Because it's not a technical solution per se, but tech is part of it.
No, yeah, tech is definitely part of it, and I think that's going to be a challenge in terms of sharing. And one of the things that we've had to do a lot of, and I know you and I have both done this a lot, is working with providers and working with these kind of core companies that end up being the central point for a lot of these problems. And so you and I all know people at Google and
XYZ,
Microsoft
yeah.
and Amazon, because you have to, because they're the central point it comes through. I do think there's been a lot of interesting work coming out of I want to say it was Norway, talking about like starting to teach a critical reading of online claims in 3rd grade, because it turns out the only solution I've seen for a lot of this mis and disinformation stuff that seems to work is preemptively getting ahead of it.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's going to have to be the approach we take. Is you've got to get people thinking about it ahead of time, and you've got to be doing things like preemptively sharing intel.
So that sounds like something very intelligence driven, Scott, and I just think that's kind of just stuck in your head, and it's just a way to show for your book, right?
I may just be infected, and that's just the way I think of things at this point. But
I don't disagree. I think getting ahead of that is pretty much the only way to do it, other than, like you said, talking to those high level providers and saying, hey, we've identified this, stop it.
But even that, I think, is almost a problem, because I wish I could cite the study that was essentially talking about the difference between changing your mind and getting the right thing out there ahead of time. And we saw this again with Ukraine.
Yes.
Where the US government published a bunch of intelligence that would never have been shared previously, simply because if they didn't get the first word, there wasn't the second. The second word is much harder to be believed, and I think that's
right.
going to be a challenge.
It's not. It's the story, not the retraction.
Yeah, because who reads retractions?
I don't read retractions. No, it's in my head.
Exactly, and again, especially for those things that sound right. And look, this is a massive change for cybersecurity, people to have to think about taking on. It's not, to your point, it's a very different problem set. I just don't know who else in most organizations is going to be able to do this kind of work.
But to that end, 20 years ago, it was a different problem set. The problem, the security issues that we're dealing with now are not security issues of 20 years ago, just from a technical perspective, right? That alone has shifted dramatically. So 20 years from now, I don't think it would be out of line to say that misinfo, disinfo is in that space, because also, to your point, who else?
Yeah. Now, I could give a more traditional answer to what you're asking as well, which is, I do think the other thing that I'm looking at a lot right now is, kind of going along with that trend of commoditization, is seeing a lot of the problems that we deal with coming from non-traditional sources. And so, you think about, if we hear about a cyber threat, chances are you're sitting there going, okay, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, which one is it?
Right.
And as we see offensive tools that are meant to help red teamers being repurposed by other folks and all that.
Well, you see a lot of the mercenary groups are getting a lot of traction. It's super duper easy to spin up your very own ransomware affiliate. It's just,
yep. There was a talk I always recommend to people that I think is great was Charlie Miller from 2007, 2008. I mean, it was a long time ago where he did a very tongue-in-cheek, I got kidnapped by, it was Kim Jong-il at the time, and forced to stand up a cyber warfare component. And I think to some extent that talk was kind of prescient because that's what's going on right now, whether we know it or not. And, I know one of the ones that I had constantly thrown out there is it had always surprised me we've never seen an intrusion or an APT group out of Cuba. There's a KGB trained intelligence apparatus 90 miles south of the United States with a huge focus on the United States. How have we never seen it? Well, I think 2 or 3 months ago, somebody came out with, there was a group that we think probably was associated with, Cuban interests who was attempting to go after different organizations in South Florida.
Right.
And I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of defenders because, the traditional interests that a criminal group has or, North Korea, China, Iran, those places are going to have is very different than the interests that a, Colombian APT group might have, or again, even countries we traditionally think of as more mutually aligned may start trying to do things like that. And so I think that's going to be the thing that when we look back in 20 years from now, we're going to sit there and go, now we look back and go, remember when it was just China and Russia? And
right.
In the last 20 years, we've gotten a couple more. I think we're going to look back in 20 years and go, hey, do you remember when it was just 4 or 5? I mean, wasn't that a whole lot easier than, keeping track? And I can't even guess how many different storm names Microsoft has to have in their back burner for their new naming scheme when they have to start,
inventing weather types. It's
Yeah. What's the Madagascar APT group's going to be named? I don't know.
I think that proliferation is really, it's bound to happen just because I think it's a bad thing, obviously, but technology in those countries we traditionally haven't heard of, I think that lends itself to be an overall good thing. I'm trying to frame the positivity in it because if there's bad guys doing tech, that means there has to be good guys doing tech in there somewhere as well. So what's coming up for you? It's eternal time. Like you've got, Interpres Life. You're helping them build all the things out. You stopped by Splunk, had a cup of coffee. You wrote a chapter in Bluenomicon. What do you got going on next?
I mean, I feel like I should be going to Disney World after just that, but no, there's the big thing lately has been we're doing Rebecca and I have been working really hard. We're doing a second edition of Intelligence-Driven Incident Response. That should be coming out just in time for Black Hat, so that'll be a really fun thing.
Where do you find the time?
I don't sleep. Really seems to be the best move. I don't recommend it. That's
so. What can I expect in the book?
It was a really interesting combination of things. When you go back and reread something like that, sometimes you're listening to it going, wow, the person who did this seems like they know what they were doing. I don't know who that was. And then sometimes you go, well, I was just an idiot and I missed all kinds of things. I think one of the biggest things we did was the original version came out about, this is how long ago it was, about 1.5 years before MITRE ATT&CK became a thing. So one of the biggest things we had to go back and add was everything around MITRE ATT&CK. And how all that, I think, for a while we were kind of wondering, is MITRE going to become a thing, MITRE ATT&CK going to become a thing like the kill chain and like the diamond model and the pyramid of pain? Is it going to be one of those foundational elements? And I think the answer is yes. I think it's, we kind of, it was everything attack for a while, and then we kind of crested a little bit and we've come down a little bit, but now we're kind of leveling off. Like we've decided it's not everything, it's not perfect, but it's dramatically better than what we were.
But if you need a starting point, if you've got nothing, this is a really good place to start.
It absolutely is, and it's given. I just think when you look at threat reporting now and you see those little T1056 or whatever, I mean that's where it's become a thing. So that was a really big addition. We pivoted a lot in terms of adding just more of here are things that are happened, here are things that are problematic. We talk a little bit about information operations.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other big thing that came out of it was Rebecca and I have just both grown a lot. We
Right.
both have had a lot more experience and spent a lot of time. And so, the chapters on, Rebecca was really the architect of some of the later chapters on strategic intelligence and how running a team doing intelligence. That was really her background, and I have since had more experience doing that than I had when we wrote the first version of the book. So there's a lot more of that. I went back to school. I've been learning a lot of stuff. Utah State has a really cool program called Anticipatory Intelligence, which is kind of let's move past the whole strategic intelligence idea that's rooted in the Cold War, and let's look at what's going to come next. And so we've added some things around that are, I think, going to be interesting in terms of a lot of times it's not, and I think this gets to what you were talking about in terms of the business aspect. A lot of times it's not just you versus a bad guy and you've got to beat them. You have to take into account that there's going to be 3 and 4 and 5 other things pushing on your exact approach. So
right.
And in addition, we just cleaned up a lot of little things that had bugged us, grammatical errors, missed this, wish I would have capitalized that. Those types of things, those little quality of life bits are a big part of it as well.
I have no idea what you mean. I have just finished Bluenomicon several times over and had the same, I missed that. Well, I am super looking forward to the book coming out. Can't wait for Black Hat, and I'll definitely look for you and Rebecca there. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today. It has been a pleasure, and I am looking forward to seeing you and the book. Any last words, any last things you want to say to anyone before we get out of here?
Pleasure as always. Happy to be here, and great talking. Looking forward to seeing you and all those things too.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching. This is our latest episode of Coffee Talk with Serge, our one-on-ones. It's Mick Baccio and Scott Roberts, and thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next